I've spent over 5,000 hours playing Bannerlord, which is an incredible amount of time. It's like working a full-time job for almost 2.5 years. With that amount of time invested, I finally feel comfortable making this video, discussing what I would change or add to Bannerlord to make it even better. Some of my suggestions are practical to implement and others are pie in the sky. But I'll start by saying you don't play a game for 5,000 hours unless you absolutely love it. So take all this criticism here with that in mind. Let's start with the combat system. It's actually one of the best parts of Bannerlord, but I feel like it has the potential to be so much more. One of my biggest gripes is how limited we are in the types of attacks we can do. Most weapons allow you to swing from 4 directions: left, right, overhead, or a thrusting stab down the middle. We also have some control over the elevation of our swing or the direction of our thrust, but that's it. We can't vary the speed of our attacks unless we rotate our entire body. We can't adjust our arms to attack from different angles. We can't hold our weapons from different locations to gain an advantage, like half swording or choking up on a spear to change the fulcrum. This limitation makes combat with some weapons extremely limited and borderline unusable. And to make matters worse, shields are more like Star Wars force fields that extend well beyond the visual range of the actual shield. This makes attacking a shielded opponent impossible to hit as long as their shield is up. Imagine how ridiculous it would have been if you couldn't stab someone's exposed leg, arm, or head because the shield blocked it. If shields were accurately portrayed and we could adjust the angle our swings and stabs were coming from, shield wall combat would be infinitely more dynamic and fun. Another addition that I would love to see is different fighting styles and stances based on your character's skill level and culture. If you watch 2 random people fighting, you would know very quickly if and how that person trained. The same is true for medieval combat. An 11th century swordsman would fight very differently from a 14th century samurai, and you would know just by watching a few exchanges. In Bannerlord, everyone swings the exact same, from level 1 to level 330, from Valandia all the way to Kazate. The only difference is their character model and gear loadout. I would love to watch a duel between 2 different cultures and see how different techniques are being used. Now let's talk about Bannerlord's damage and armor system, which is more like a spreadsheet with several errors than a real-life combat system. Damage is often predictable and linear, with little to no adherence to real-life combat. Taking a slashing hit from a large 2-handed sword will be fatal, even if the opponent has the best plate or lamellar armor. On the flip side, you can take 2 or 3 arrows directly to the eyeball, even without a helmet, provided the person shooting it doesn't have high bow skill and lots of perks. The worst offenders of them all though, thrusting spear attacks do very little damage, especially against armored opponents. There are some mods that try to address this issue, my favorite of which is RBM. Their damage models are much closer to reality and make spears great again. They even add hitboxes for vulnerable areas like the throat and armpit, oftentimes resulting in instant death. I would love to see an overhaul to the armor and weapon systems to be more like RBM and maybe even go a step further, closer to realistic combat. Armor would be more effective, but effective strikes would be more lethal. Hitting someone in full plate with a slashing weapon would do little to no damage unless you hit a vulnerable area. On the flip side, wearing little to no armor means even a single strike would be fatal. Another aspect of Bannerlord that is lacking that RBM tries to address is a fatigue system. I know most people hate the posture system, but my guess is it's the best that the mod developers could do within the constraints of the base game. To make it even better, I would love to see an actual stamina bar that is used up when moving, attacking, blocking, etc. It could recharge with rest, but not back to its previous high, as there should be some long-term fatigue that builds up within a battle. Maybe after 30 minutes of fighting, troops would be able to regain 50% or less of their max stamina, which would change the dynamics of a long battle. Could your army actually handle enemy reinforcements, or should you retreat to rest and fight another day? While RBM is a great step in the right direction, it's not perfect. The mod makes high-tier units nearly indestructible, but doesn't reflect that change in their cost or availability. I'm fine with god-tier units in an army, but they should be extremely difficult to obtain and upgrade, and be 10 to 20 times more expensive to hire and maintain. Imagine a battle where 10% of your forces are elite and the rest are a mix of rabble and low-skilled professionals. Where would you deploy your small elite regiment? Do you commit them at the start? Do you hold them in reserve? Do you split them and flank from both sides? Now imagine your opponent has the same army composition and you have to worry about where they deploy their elite troops. Your tactical decision would actually matter in this case, instead of F1, F3 like Sun Tzu suggests. The next section I want to cover is near and dear to my heart, tactics. And I don't mean the skill, but actual tactics in combat. I've seen massive 1,000 unit battles take 5 minutes or less from start to finish. Combat during these times would often take several days to conclude, and while I'm not suggesting a 48-hour long epic battle, it would be nice to have a bit more time for tactics and maneuvering. I've already mentioned increasing the effectiveness of armor like RBM, which does increase the duration of battles, but there are a few more things I would change as well. RBM also changes the AI behavior to mimic troops' fear of death, making units more hesitant to engage in battle and lose their life. This is great, but needs some tweaks. Lower tier units should be much more hesitant to engage, while elite troops should have little to no fear. To go along with this change, it'd be great to see morale play an actual role in combat. In its current state, both peasants and elite troops will rarely flee from battle, oftentimes staying until the last 10% are left. I would love to see some kind of sliding scale for morale. Peasants fleeing with 20% casualties or more, mid-tier fleeing with 50% casualties or more, and elite troops staying until the bitter end. And while we're on the topic of morale, I would love to see fleeing units have the ability to rally and re-enter the battle once more. As soon as a unit flees in Bannerlord, it's 100% lost for that battle, but it would be nice to see them rally and continue to fight. Total War has this mechanic and makes for some tough tactical decisions. If you run down fleeing enemy units, you deny them re-entry to the battle, but you also give up the chance to attack other units that might be causing casualties to your army in that time. Every decision on the battlefield should have an opportunity cost of some sort. One thing about Bannerlord that annoys me is the large battles will always end with one side being completely obliterated, while the other side takes very few lost troops and many injured that will eventually heal up. Some combat in this time period did end with decisive results, but most engagements ended with both sides still intact and able to continue fighting. While I'm not suggesting all battles end this way in Bannerlord, it would be great to see more possible outcomes to battles. If we knew that the enemy could potentially leave the battle intact and link up with another nearby army or retreat back to the safety of a castle, then our tactical decisions during that battle would be very, very different. Now let's compare some of these changes to how the base game currently runs. You go into war with your neighbor, run your elite army into the AI's crappy army, charge everyone in without much thought, kill 50% of their units, and have the other 50% who were injured or fled evaporate into thin air. Rinse and repeat 10 more times because the AI will just spam you with army after army of the same boring, lopsided battles. Now let's try this again with my suggestions in place. Our army is balanced because we can't spam only elite troops. The enemy's army is balanced as well for the same reason. We engage them in battle and win, inflicting some casualties and causing a rout, but they're still intact with 70% of their original size. Now we must maneuver our army in such a way that they cannot retreat back to reinforcements or the safety of a town or castle. Perhaps the next time we do battle, we'll have to take more risks to inflict a decisive victory, but also risk being defeated ourselves. Battles would be much more dynamic and impactful instead of the current spam, rinse, and repeat cycle that we have. While we're here on the topic of tactics, some small changes that I would think make a massive difference would be to add more options for unit formations. Please give us an increase or decrease rank button instead of making us click and drag the formation every single time. It would also be nice to make a formation with multiple units and then be able to save that arrangement and give move orders to everyone at once. For example, if I want to make a Shiltron formation, I need to move all 4 sides of the box to move into place. If I want this box to move, I have to move everyone individually and pray that they line up the way that we want. Instead, we should be able to make a beautiful formation and move them as one cohesive group. One final note on this, there is a mod called Scatter Around that works amazingly with ranged units. I would love to see this in the base game. It allows you to place markers for individual units of a group, like along a ridge or a castle wall. This would allow us the option to spread out ranged units to get better angles instead of forcing them into one giant clump. Another small change that would be amazing to see is more depth to the Delegate command. Currently, delegating command often means charging the bulk of your army into the enemy without any thought, F1, F3 style. Instead, I would like to see more options for delegating commands such as playing defense, skirmishing, and even F1, F3 aggro. The main reason I would use delegate command is so that I could participate in combat myself. But if the AI is just going to charge in, then I'll often sit back and have to command my units manually. If I could direct them to play defense while I command my cavalry or horse archers on a harassing maneuver, it would make battles so much more fun and dynamic. And these options could easily be balanced by locking them behind tactics perks. And for my final suggestion on tactics, I would really like to see the AI have more than 2 options. They either run to the back corner of the map and wait for death, or they charge straight at you with everything they have. No tactics involved. I know AI is incredibly difficult to program, so I don't have much hope here, but just imagine doing battle with an AI that was capable of advanced tactics, like double envelopment, pincer maneuvers, or false gap. I wouldn't even be mad losing a battle to superior tactics like that. Now let's talk about the economy of Bannerlord. On the surface, there's some complexity here. Villages make raw materials, which then get taken to towns and turn into manufactured goods to be traded off. Caravans will then go town to town buying up the surplus and selling to other towns with a shortage. It's almost clever enough to pass for a living, breathing economy. But if you watch a town's bank balance, it will increase or decrease up to a certain percentage of its prosperity each day, either making money out of thin air to fill up an empty bank balance, or siphoning excess away into the abyss while the equilibrium point is reached. Notables who own caravans and workshops don't actually get to use their profits for anything, so that money is fictional as well. What about goods that are produced? Towns use up a certain mix and quantity of items from their shops each day, but it's just a number in a spreadsheet. Nobody is using these items, the profits from selling them don't go anywhere, and if a town doesn't have enough goods to satisfy the demand, it will keep chugging along like nothing happened. It's not a real, functioning economy. This means when you raid villages, caravans, villager parties, and etc., nothing is actually lost because the town will continue on no matter what happens. Sure, it might lose some prosperity temporarily, but you can't actually hurt an enemy faction economically this way, since towns can generate money from thin air. I would love to see an actual closed-loop economy where economic warfare could actually be a thing. Becoming a bandit to raid caravans and villages in an area could actually make a difference and bring a kingdom to its knees. You could create a monopoly of a certain product and starve the rest of the world of it, creating some amount of damage. As of right now, the only effect creating a monopoly has is to make more money, but as we'll discuss in the next section, money has very little use past the early or mid game. Let's talk about money and how useless it is for most of the game. Currently, you can purchase troops, gear, mounts, and food with money. You can buy workshops or start a caravan to make more of it. You can even pump money into a fief to speed up the construction. But what happens when you have more money than you could possibly spend on those things? Not much really. You can gain relations by giving it away, and you could pay for peace deals or buy a spouse, but those generally aren't a big deal either. I would really like to see something else to do with our cash. Paying people to do things for us like attacking an enemy, raiding a specific settlement, or capturing a noble to be our prisoner. We could pay a courier to send communications for us, like speaking to other nobles or managing our fiefs without actually having to be there. We could pay for cosmetic things to be made in our honor like clothing, crowns, banners, or special non-functional buildings in our settlements. Or perhaps we could hire someone to recruit and train units for us so we don't have to manually do it. I can't tell you how many campaigns I've gotten to the mid-game and had nothing to spend my tens of millions of Denars on, which made money completely obsolete at that point. I've got a couple smaller points before we move on. There are way too many caravans on the map. Caravans reduce scarcity of items on the map, and a lack of scarcity means things are too stable and boring. Once a caravan is destroyed, it automatically respawns for free, meaning there's no way to reduce their numbers. And as we discussed before, notables who own caravans don't actually use the money for anything, so the money they earn goes nowhere, and the money they spend is generated from nowhere. I would like to see caravan numbers decrease or make it so they can't respawn so easily. We should be able to starve the world by raiding caravans into the ground if we want, and we should have to protect those caravans from being raided if we're trying to run a sustainable economy. And finally, I would like to see more options for villages. There's no reason a castle or town has building options, but villages do not. Upgrades could range anywhere from offering more troop slots to recruit from, different types of troops to recruit, like stables offering more cavalry, an archery range to spawn more archers, etc. Or buildings to increase the tier of troops being offered, and the obvious stuff like increasing production or increasing the militia. Currently, owning a single fief can be an underwhelming experience. You select the building to upgrade and wait for several months for it to finish. But if we controlled villages, now we have 3 to 5 upgrades to manage at once. You wouldn't need to own half the map to actually have things to do during those times of peace. Moving on, let's discuss companions. These special characters can be hired to fill several roles in a clan, like completing quests, party roles like surgeon or scout, leading their own party, or governing a fief. Unfortunately, they are mostly forgettable and very optional. The only time I feel they're an absolute requirement is when they lead a party within a clan, or they fill a party role that the main character cannot. Outside of that, they have very little use. It's incredibly difficult to level their skills because of how poorly the AI performs with them. If you've ever tried to level a companion from level 100 up to 300 plus, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Oftentimes, companions are difficult to level up because they start with a high level already. Their focus and attribute points are already spread out so thin that you can't really do anything particularly well. And to top it off, the game caps how many companions you can actually use. Now, some of my best memories with Bannerlord were playing modded, where I unlocked the companion cap, reset everybody to start at level 1, and built them up from the ground up. I also increased their XP gains significantly so they could actually reach proficiency before dying of old age. I ended up with a small group of custom-equipped, handcrafted companions that I felt an emotional connection to and actually cared how well each one did in battle. Losing one in combat was traumatic, compared to vanilla where they're basically placeholders and can be replaced by anyone without batting an eye. I would love to see more options to run a campaign like this, and some game mechanics to go with it. When I ran my bandit companion crew, I used Fubery to give more options to sustain an income and different missions to help level them up. I used Banner King when running my Varangian Guard campaign and promoted my Varangians to be nobles as soon as fiefs were captured, slowly growing a kingdom from scratch. The stories that arose from raising these companions from scratch over 5 or 10 years to eventually running their own clans, getting married, having their own kids, and defending the kingdom with me were unforgettable. More options is always better. Let's talk briefly about quests. Most quests in Bannerlord are fine for the first week or two of a campaign, but they quickly become boring, repetitive, and not worth the time invested. They also don't seem to be connected to anything. For example, if I complete Train the Troops for a village, we get a pop-up asking to send them back, but if you actually visit the village, they are nowhere to be found. Much like the money in a town, they disappear into thin air. Slave labor dropped off at an ore mine doesn't actually increase the production of that mine. Supplies dropped off make no difference for the village growth, etc. I would much prefer quests be generated out of an actual need in the world and have it affect the world positively. If a town has a lack of a certain supply, they could put up a quest to bring said supplies and pay the reward out of the town's bank balance. Those supplies would sell for a premium due to the high demand and zero supply, so they would easily make their money back. Along with making quests meaningful, it would be nice to see them scale with the character. Finding hogs for a village when you own half the map isn't rewarding, so why not offer harder quests with better rewards? For example, what if a fief we owned offered a quest to capture a noble who had raided them in the past? The reward for completing this quest could be something meaningful like becoming a supporter of yours. Supporters give daily influence gain and a slight loyalty boost to the fief, two things that are highly prized in the late game. Or executing the noble for you without causing relations loss. I would also like to see quests offered by other kingdoms to attack an enemy of theirs. Rewards could vary from full sets of lordly tier 6 armor, a group of noble tier troops, or even marriage with one of their family members. In short, make quests meaningful, scalable, and worth our time. I don't want to spend too much time on the next section as it's been discussed ad nauseum already. The early and mid game are fun and engaging, while the late game suffers from a lack of meaningful and fun options. Once you conquer a dozen fiefs or so, the game turns into a stale, rinse and repeat cycle until the whole map is painted one color. To add some variety and challenge, a few things could be added. Invasions from the edge of the map by a massive army, quelling an internal rebellion, funneling resources into a massive construction project like how Civ games do, creating a booming economy and spending all that money on the extra options we discussed earlier, like paying kingdoms to attack each other for you. I've got a whole list of things that could be wildly fun and interesting, but literally anything would be better than the void that we currently have. It's time to get a bit salty here. Let's chat about diplomacy, or rather the lack of any. Currently, diplomacy consists of declaring war or declaring peace. That's literally it. Even worse, you can pay for peace with a 100% acceptance rate provided you pay enough money. You can start a war, take a fief, and immediately sue for peace, and they'll accept it. It makes absolutely no sense. In Paradox games, most wars won't conclude without land concessions. In Bannerlord, just a few Denars will suffice. It'd be great to see war and peace deals have some actual meaning behind them, rather than an Excel calculation for an exchange of money. Aside from war and peace, there should be many more diplomatic options. Alliances, non-aggression pacts, defensive pacts, trade agreements, trade embargoes, etc. All of these could dramatically change how the mid and late game work, making campaigns much more dynamic. To piggyback on the previous note, each diplomatic play should come at a money cost, but also an influence cost. Like I said previously with trade, scarcity is what makes things fun and meaningful. If we have to decide between spending influence to pass a policy or forming an alliance because we don't have enough to do both, then we actually have to think and make a plan. Currently, I end campaigns with hundreds of millions of Denars and tens of thousands of influence with nothing meaningful to spend either of them on. One area of running a kingdom and diplomacy that made no sense was how little time and attention we need to spend on managing our vassals. They get recruited into a kingdom, and that's generally the last interaction you have with them outside of voting down their idiotic peace and war votes. We should have to spend money, time, and influence to keep them happy and loyal. Now, I mentioned Paradox earlier, which brings me to my next point. There's no anti-snowball mechanic in Bannerlord. EU4 has aggressive expansion, CK3 has holy wars, etc., but in Bannerlord you can simply walk all over the entire map within a few years once you reach a critical mass of troops. If the previous suggestion of having alliances and defensive pacts were taken into consideration, then many from outside of the kingdom would try to band together to avoid being annihilated, much like the coalitions did against Napoleon. And finally, for diplomacy, marriages and companions should play a much larger role. Marriages could be used to initiate alliances, and companions could be used as couriers to speak on our behalf and negotiate, making their charm skill actually mean something. Currently, marrying off female family members is a terrible idea, as you gain a small amount of money and some relations, both of which are useless in the mid to late game. But if we were to give away a sister or a daughter in order to ally with a neighbor, that's something worth considering. Moving on to tournaments. I actually don't mind tournaments so much in its current state, but I feel like they could be better. I do like how each culture has its own format, but it's still disorganized. If you want to train one-handed skill, you might get stuck in a tournament with bow or polearm half the time. On top of that, XP gain is drastically reduced from real combat, which takes some of the satisfaction out of it. The roster of combatants also makes little to no sense. You can join a tournament on day 1 and be paired with both peasants and nobles with 300 combat skill alike. Instead, I would like to see tournaments split up into different categories based on the skill you want to train. One-handed, bow, riding, etc. A bow tournament could easily comprise of 2 separate teams with bows, arrow barrels, and an obstacle course to take cover behind. It would also be great to add tactics as a category. Contestants would not be able to personally fight, but give commands from the stands to defeat their opponents. I would actually enjoy farming tactics skill this way, instead of cheesing it with sacrificing troops to get away from battle. There should also be a requirement to enter tournaments. For example, low-tier tournaments can only be enrolled in at Clan Tier 1 or lower, while the hardest tournaments only accessible to Clan Tier 5 or higher. When those grand tournaments are being held, we could still attend and watch, but would have to wait to compete until the late game when we reach those clan tiers. Prizes should scale accordingly, with the top tournaments giving items that can't be purchased in-game, like Tier 6 Lordly Army pieces, cosmetic items for civilian clothes that actually make you look like a ruler, etc. I'm tired of getting the same garbage 600 dinar weapons and mid-tier helmets. A few minor points on tournaments before we move on. In previous Mountain Blades, we were able to dedicate a tournament win to a female of the host's clan, making it easier to propose a marriage. Having this added to Bannerlord wouldn't be a huge deal, but would add to the immersion and feel of the time period. As it pertains to tournaments, we should also be able to nominate someone from our clan to compete in a tournament for us. Currently, our companions and family members must be in the town when the tournament begins, and there's an algorithm that determines if they join or not. It's 100% out of the player's control. If we could nominate them, we could send people based on who's most likely to win the tournament, or based on who needs the most combat XP at the time, and have another way to level them up. Now, this next section could be an entire video on its own, so I've actually decided to generalize my talking points here rather than going through each one by one. Skills, perks, and character builds are one of the main selling points of Bannerlord, but I feel they fall short in some areas. For starters, I dislike most of the perks in the game. It feels like feast or famine when making our picks. They're either completely overpowered or totally useless. A perfect example of overpowered are the prisoner escape perks. With only 2 perks, you can hold prisoners without them ever escaping. It's completely OP. On the flip side, there are literally dozens of 1% and 2% damage perks and are basically useless unless you stack all of them together. But at that point, it's not really a choice of which perk is best. We're basically locked into picking the same perks over and over to make a build work. There are close to 1,000 perks in the game. I know I've cataloged them all, and balancing them must be a nightmare. Personally, I wouldn't mind a smaller pool of perks to pick from, but make both options a difficult choice. I want to feel pain for not being able to pick both of them and having to give one up, not indifference because one perk is objectively bad. I also think some skills need to be completely reworked. Why does roguery give more loot after battle instead of giving more loot from raiding caravans and villages? Why can't tactics give some benefit while commanding troops in battle instead of auto-resolve only? Why is trade just plain terrible? I certainly don't have all the answers here, but I know the bar is set so low with some of these skills that nearly anything would be better than what we currently have. There are literally thousands of forum posts on smithing and crafting, so I won't repeat much of that here. In summary, smithing is completely unbalanced, and it's incredibly overpowered when it comes to leveling up and making money. They've tried to nerf it almost a dozen times now, and it's still too strong. Aside from that aspect, I would really like to see crafting of armor pieces, ranged weapons like bow, crossbow, arrows, bolts, banners, and even some cosmetic items just to make our armor sets look unique. And the final puzzle piece to this massive rant. There needs to be more customization when it comes to difficulty and campaign options. I look towards a game like Project Zomboid for inspiration on this. They have literally pages and pages worth of settings and sliders that can be adjusted to make any campaign feel unique, challenging, chill, or whatever the player wants. I understand making options more limited for the campaign mode, but the devs literally labeled the second mode Sandbox. So please, give us a sandbox game. Let us adjust our companion limit, death chance for units and heroes, damage given and taken, XP multipliers for the character and the companions, etc. I have enough faith in our player base to pick the options that suit us the best on what kind of campaign we want to play. As I've said before, I didn't get to 5,000 hours into Bannerlord because I thought it was crap. It's an amazing game that allows a ton of freedom, creativity, and adventure. Modding definitely helps open up a lot more options, but there's still a massive list of things that could be even better. Many of my suggestions are simply not practical, and I accept that. But even if only one of my suggestions are taken up by the devs, then I'll consider it mission accomplished. I'm curious what you personally think is the worst part of Bannerlord and how you would change it. A huge shout out to the YouTube channel members and Patreon supporters who help keep this channel going. I really appreciate it. As soon as the unit fleet and link up with another nearby, spend my tens of millions of plan to compete couriers to speak on behalf and to speak on our